It's the end of an era in Seattle, as Pete Carroll and the Seahawks parted ways after the most successful tenure in franchise history. ESPN's Mina Kimes joins us to discuss the impact Pete had, what it means for Seattle, and what comes next. Let's light them up. I'm Jackson Bevins, and this is Cigar Thoughts. Welcome back to the Cigar Lounge. I am Jackson Bevins, and along with my dear friend and producer, Mike Barwin, this is the Cigar Thoughts podcast. Mike, how are we doing today? Yeah.
It's been a whole lot of 1,000-yard stares over the last 24 hours, Jackson. But, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around the fact that the Pete Carroll era in Seattle is officially finished. But here we are. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing okay. I'm sad. I'm also excited.
Yeah.
Because what we've known for the last decade and a half has been really good. It also hasn't been good enough for a while. And in that regard, there's a part of me that's excited to gamble that what comes next can be better.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we're plunging into a whole new frontier. We are engaging in a full-blown coaching carousel for the first time in a decade and a half.
Totally.
It's new territory, and the potential for a new spin on what I think you and I can agree is a pretty exciting roster. Like there are some pieces there that should get you excited as a Seahawks fan. It's going to be cool seeing who they choose to be the architect, or at least the partner / understudy to John Schneider,
right?
In helping that roster hopefully achieve more than they have in the past few years.
Yeah. It's, normally in this part of our discussion, I've got like a really strong opinion in terms of what I think should happen. And for the longest time, it's been mostly status quo. Like, of course, I've wanted to see changes in certain things, but the feeling of just tearing it all down and starting anew, like you flirt with it, but I've never really wanted it. And now it's here. And the good news is, usually if you're looking for a new head coach, it's because you sucked the last season. And it's the whole darker, it's darkest before the dawn type of approach to this. I don't actually feel that way. This is a team that has won 18 games over the last 2 years, that made the playoffs in 2022 and missed it on a tiebreaker this year. I got to think as a head coach, this is a pretty attractive situation.
Yeah. And I don't know if we're going to get too much into that final game of the season, but just as a quick interjection here, I feel like Matt Prater should be investigated for like some sort of fraud or something. Like we need to get the SEC on this guy. Like there's some sort of like Swiss bank accounts involved that, that Marvin Harrison Jr. ends up in Arizona.
He's going to get, they were like, hey, you're going to get 5% of Marvin Harrison Jr.'s career
Marvin
earnings
Harrison
if you
Sr.
miss these
was
kicks.
In his DM saying some pretty aggressive things.
Yeah. It just would have been so sad if it ended with Prater making that kick, and that was like kind of the final moment in Pete Carroll's tenure. Instead, it ends up being that his final call was eschewing the game-tying extra point and going for 2 and getting it. It just felt like the perfect ending.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And 2 years ago, when the Seahawks traded Russell Wilson to the Denver Broncos, if in that moment, the reaction that we felt to that trade going down, you would have told yourself, Pete Carroll is going to unequivocally win this breakup in the eyes of the public. And the Seahawks are going to have 2 consecutive winning seasons. They're going to make the playoffs in one of them. I think you'd be pretty damn thrilled. And then if you, after that, told me that Pete Carroll's going to get fired after that, after year 2 of what I think we can agree is a fairly successful retooling, but also not quite what we need it to be, Yeah, it's a lot to process, man.
It's 2 divorces in 2 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
The 2 biggest in the 46-year history of this franchise, half a century.
Yeah.
And the 2 biggest splits ever just happened.
With everything that we know, with how the defense has performed, how he's had his hands in it, how everything has unfolded since that point that Russell Wilson was traded, do you think that Pete earned or deserved, or however you want to look at it, a 3rd year to see how everything looks with, if Pete was still here, I think it would still be Geno starting. Obviously that is maybe more up in the air now than it was, but do you think that Pete deserved that 3rd year after the retooling began?
Deserved? Yes. Is it the optimal? I don't know. There was never going to be an easy exit point for the Pete Carroll.
There never is.
It's like, it was really, really good. The relationship was good. And it's a little bit of like a default to compare this to like a romantic relationship. But even on a professional level, it's like, if you've worked at a job for a long time and you've really established yourself as a performer in that job, at some point, and I've been both employee and employer in my life, and seeing this from both sides, like, I get it from both sides.
Yeah.
There's got to be a part of Pete Carroll that, if he wants to keep coaching, and that's the vibe I got from his post-game press conference, like, that fire is still there. It probably always will be. That guy's going to live till he's 120, and he'd probably coach till he's 120 if he can. It feels that way. But entering the first offseason of, honestly, the last 40 years of his life without knowing exactly what is coming next, or knowing that like he's in full control of what comes next, maybe just time with Glenna. Like, when he cried in the press conference, I cried watching.
Got misty over here.
Because I transported myself 30 years into my future thinking about Paulina. Like, I married the best person that I've ever met in my life. And like, my goal every day is to justify her decision to marry me. And
your takes make it pretty difficult sometimes, but
I know, right, exactly. I'm like misting up right now. I'm sad. Like, I'm excited, but I am sad, and not in that like, oh, we're making a huge mistake, it's never going to get better. It's just
moving on's bittersweet.
It is. And one thing that I'm proud of is I focus on appreciating things that are good when they're here. And I think that mostly I did that while Pete Carroll was here. Mm-hmm. But man, there's also a decent chance that like in the next 9 to 12 months, I'm going to be kicking myself for all the things that I got frustrated with too. You know what I'm saying?
Yep. That Monday through Saturday is going to loom large depending on how the next year plus transpires. But
I mean, here's the deal. Since I've been like old enough to really like pay attention to who was coaching my favorite teams, between, I've been a Trailblazers fan my whole life, even when the Sonics were here, been Mariners fan, been a Seahawks fan, UW fan. There have been dozens of coaches, dozens of them that have come and gone, and they come and go. And it's okay. Yeah, I was sad when Mike Holmgren stepped down, sad when Lou Piniella stepped down. But like, for the most part, you're like, okay, yeah, all right, this is the natural life cycle. I've never been hit like this.
No.
And, that's what I was writing about in that article I posted last night. Like, I teared up writing it, and that wasn't my goal at all. But I was like about to sign off on my last article of the Pete Carroll era, because I started writing about the Seahawks 4 field goals during Pete Carroll's first year as a coach. Like, my faint shadow of a career compared to Pete's lines up with his tenure in Seattle completely. And it's like it's different now. So, yeah, man, I'm
some
feeling
unfortunate
it.
news. You're also fired. So, congrats on your next era as well.
Oh man, there's some people listening who are probably not sad to hear that. No, honestly, like
Yeah.
I am excited about the transition. That's the thing. It's like, my mom told me something when I was in my 20s that's always stuck with me. It was maybe the nicest thing anyone's ever said about me. But she said, one thing that's always stood out about you is you got every single drop out of each chapter of your life before you move to the next one. And I feel like I got every drop out of the Pete Carroll experience, but it is time. Head versus heart, it is time. And there's a part of me that's really excited to see what comes next.
No doubt. No doubt. I think the thing that I've been thinking about a lot is, and again, the decision, it's understandable. It probably was time. I am bummed that Pete Carroll and Devin Witherspoon don't get to spend at least.
I know, man.
That's
They're just
tough.
a perfect fit. They're
That's
a perfect
tough.
fit.
And the way that he was waxing about him after the draft, he compared him to Troy Polamalu, right after they drafted him. He'd never touched grass, and it was just, it's tough. But,
no, you texted me that yesterday, and I felt it. And listen, the Seahawks have made big moves before. Hiring Mike Holmgren, like I said, Mike Holmgren leaving, the Russell Wilson trade, decisions regarding the LOB era players. But somehow this one feels bigger than all the rest. And we'll dive into it with Mina in a moment. But real quick, if you're listening or watching us right now, it's hopefully because you like the show. And if you like the show, there are a few ways that you can support it. If you're on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, take a couple seconds to leave us a 5-star rating. And if you're feeling super supportive, a quick review as well. You can do that right now. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you'll find full video episodes, entertaining clips, and the audio reads of every Cigar Thoughts article. This is probably the best way to help the show grow, and growth is going to enable us to bring more of our football discourse your way, so we're grateful for the few seconds it takes to like and subscribe. We're also thrilled to have the awesome partnership with Westland Distillery in Seattle, which is my favorite local whiskey maker. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll see me enjoying a glass of their single cask barrel number 6554, which combines a smooth sipping experience and tons of flavor. Westland is an American single malt whiskey distillery in the Soto neighborhood of Seattle. Their tasting room and bar are open to the public, where they serve whiskey flights, cocktails, and small plates. There's a bottle shop on site featuring distillery exclusive releases and more, located at 2931 First Avenue, a little over a mile south of Lumen Field. And, as I've mentioned before, their Garyana number 8 was just named the number 3 whiskey in the entire world by Whiskey Advocate. Needless to say, I'm stoked to be working with them, and one of the reasons I love their whiskey so much is that they're excellent pairings with a good cigar. And speaking of, as you know, we do have our own special release of cigars that you can purchase at a terrific price as a listener of the show. Until now, you've been able to order your own bundle of 10 for just $169, which is less than half of what this blend sells for in cigars on the open market. A number of you sent us pictures of the Cigar Thought Stogies that you either gave or received as gifts, which is just awesome. And because it's the holiday season and we're coming out of it, we lowered the price to just $149, and we've decided to keep it there for a while. That's right, just $149 for a bundle of 10. As many of you know, we partnered with one of the most prestigious cigar manufacturers in the world to release these official Cigar Thought cigars, which you can order directly from cigarthoughtsnfl.com. Just follow the link on the show page to get these easy-to-smoke stogies rolled with 13-year aged premium Dominican tobacco leaf, or hit us up on Twitter or Instagram and we'll send you the details directly. And the cigars, they come with a Bovita humidification pack and a Mylar storage bag to make sure they stay fresh whether you have a humidor or not. Listen, man, you know that old GIF? It's like a black and white reel of some circus performer getting shot point blank in the stomach by a cannonball. That's what I felt like when I heard the news that Pete Carroll was out as head coach.
Yeah.
I had just wrapped up a meeting with a client and my phone was practically melting through the table. They were such wonderful people to talk with. I'm just like, what is going on? Now, we've all had about 24 hours since then to process the news. And last night, I found myself writing maybe the most heartfelt piece of my life. Just reliving the Pete Carroll experience and really examining the impact it had on me, not just as a Seahawks fan, but as a man, as a husband, as a professional. And if those of you listening want to read it, you can find it on fieldgoals.com. It's titled Pete Carroll, One of One. But I am just one of millions whose lives were affected by Pete Carroll, and I couldn't be happier to be joined by someone who can relate. She needs no introduction, but I'm going to give her one anyway. She is one of the brightest stars in all of sports media, and I am proud to call her a friend. She's a staple on air at ESPN and the host of the wonderful Mina Kimes show featuring Lenny. She is Mina Kimes. Mina, thank you for coming in during what must be a whirlwind couple of days for you.
You didn't introduce me as the semifinalist in our fantasy league, second place finisher, one-time champion, first-time champion, inaugural champion is how I like to be.
Yeah. Your team was so fraudulent this year.
I know. You're
like sixth in scoring.
Yeah,
get out of here.
I was the 22 Vikings of our league, and it really caught up with me at the end. It always does. The numbers never lie.
It did. Yeah,
it's not
totally. But I got to tip my hat. You put together a good team every year. You should.
Thanks for nothing.
Just do it for a living. Yeah.
It's good.
Feelings mutual.
It's good to catch up, Jackson. I loved your piece. I just finished it. I just read our friend Danny Kelly's piece as well. It was very good. It's a complicated moment because and we've been talking about this for the last 24 hours in our text thread, and I think a lot of Seahawks fans have been kind of processing this as well. I have mixed feelings about it. I think I have mixed feelings about the decision. I don't have mixed feelings about Pete Carroll's tenure in Seattle, which was undeniably a massive success. And we can discuss that as well. But as far as like the wisdom of this decision, what's next for Seattle, that I'm still working through my thoughts. So I'm excited to be here to talk to you about it.
Cool. Yeah, we are too. And it's funny, when you and I initially talked about you coming on, I think we both thought we'd spend most of the time recapping the season, looking ahead to what moves Seattle might make next. And we're going to do that. But then the Seahawks tossed a grenade into the room and our phones exploded with the news that Pete Carroll was no longer going to be the head coach of the Seahawks. What was your first reaction when you heard?
I was shocked. I didn't think they were going to do it. And obviously, missing the playoffs the way they did, largely because of the defense, I had questions about whether they could fix the problems that plagued them this season and whether Pete Carroll was the right person to make those fixes based on what's happened in the last few years. But because of a combination of things, his track record in Seattle, and then, his record with the owner, Jody Allen, seemed like they were in lockstep most of the time. Obviously, the trade of Russell Wilson reflected that. And then, there hadn't been whispers of this. There were some reports like, Pete Carroll might be retiring. Like there was a little bit of that, but I didn't see or hear anything in the way of like, ownership's unhappy. The way, with Bill Belichick, we've been hearing it all season, and so it kind of felt inevitable. That wasn't the case with this, so I was surprised. It shocked me when it happened.
Yeah, every offseason since like 2018, really, we've all kind of wondered about moving on from Carroll. But if you're anything like me, it always felt very hypothetical. Now it's real. And as hard as it is to say, the Pete Carroll era is now behind us. But as you look back over the last 14 years, and it really is crazy for a head coach in the modern NFL to be around for 14 years, what are some moments or memories that stick out to you about his time here?
I think the most Pete Carroll season, even though it wasn't even close to being one of his most successful seasons, was maybe the last one before the Russell Wilson era began. And Beastquake was the year before that, I believe. But watching the formation of the Legion of Boom, which started in, I guess, 2010, right? It was really when that began. And then you add Earl Thomas, you add Cam Chancellor and Richard Sherman and Brandon Browner and all of it, and it kind of comes together. I don't think people who didn't watch the NFL closely then will understand not just how impactful that defense was, but how unique of an experience it was to watch them. Jackson, I'm sure you can relate to this. Like, I used to be excited when our defense took the field because they played with like a level of physicality and a style and a swagger that was not something I had seen before on the Seahawks team, and obviously very different from what we see now. And I think that embodied Pete's philosophy. It embodied not just his philosophy as a schematic mind, as a play caller, as a coach, but also, well, I would say as a coach, because the thing people sometimes forget about Legion of Boom is like Earl Thomas was the only first round draft pick, right? So like it embodied his always compete philosophy, which is like I will give every player a chance to make this team, and then I will coach them up, and that unit reflected that. And then culturally, I think like his identity as a coach was kind of manifested through that unit. So that really jumps out to me. And then I'll say the other thing that really, and I know I'm skipping past the entire Russell Wilson era because I'm doing before and after, and there's a lot of moments from the Russell Wilson era that jump out. But I mean, a lot of the interactions with Jim Harbaugh during that rivalry were incredible.
What's your deal, man?
What's your deal, man? I mean, come on. Today's kids will never understand how much those coaches hated each other. The teams hated each other. It was amazing. It was an amazing rivalry. And then, but then I'll add one more recent one, which is the Russ return with Geno Smith.
Oh,
and again,
goodness.
This is another example of the always compete philosophy, which is, Pete letting Geno Smith win that job and trusting him with it. And he paid off big time with that signature win. That was a signature win. So yeah, there's a lot of great memories, but those are ones that stand out to me.
Those are really good ones. I'm really glad you mentioned about the excitement of watching the defense, because, it's like you and I were both Mariners fans, right? And it's normally when you got like John Halama pitching or whoever, you're just like, just get us through the inning. I want to see my guys hit. I want to get the offense back up there. But if Felix was pitching or if Randy Johnson was pitching, you were like stoked about the Mariners being in the field. That's how I felt during the LOB era. It was like watching Felix pitch every single game. And, it was about 2016 where this feeling started to shift, and I actually became aware of it. It was something that I felt but had never put words to before then. Was every time that I would see like 2011, like from the moment that rookie Richard Sherman called Hall of Famer AJ Green a lot of noise and bad routes, I was like, oh shit, we got something here. Every time you would see the opposing quarterback drop back and tilt his shoulders like he's going deep, I was like, hell yeah. Because I felt like it was just as likely that a Seahawk was going to catch that pass as it was the intended receiver. And then that is not the case, obviously, anymore. I'm so glad you brought that up, because I don't know how many fans of teams in the modern NFL have ever really had that experience. For me, there's so many Pete Carroll memories. And there's, as I was writing that piece yesterday, I mean, it's 3,000 words. It could have been 30,000 words. But one that, as I was kind of retracing the steps, that stood out to me was during Super Bowl 48. And of course, Mike and I were talking about it right before you get on the air. We're just, our stomachs is in a knot. It's just the biggest game ever. It just even felt bigger than Super Bowl 40. And they we're past the Percy Harvin touchdown return. We're all kind of popping the champagne. And Pete, most coaches, even if it's a blowout win in the biggest game ever, they're still just looking sourpussed, all stern and focused until the final gun sounds. And they're like surprised by the Gatorade bath and all these things. And I get it. Like, they're staying locked in. Pete Carroll is on the sideline joking with Marshawn Lynch, talking about, are we allowed to score more points? Coach, you think it's okay if we score more points? And Pete's like, I don't know. You want to score some more points? And I was like, this dude is just in the moment, like 100%. And, one of the things I wrote last night is I've always wanted to believe that joy is something more than just the result of success, that it can be the cause of success. And with Pete Carroll, the joy is the reason they were successful. And I always really admired that about him.
That's really well said. Yeah. I mean, he makes coaching actually look fun and not like misery. I think Mike McDaniel in Miami has a similar quality, oddly, because they're very different people and very different styles and all that, or different impacts on teams. But when you watch him and you watch footage of him, you see that similar like twinkle in his eye, the delight of celebrating players. And Pete mentioned that in his final press conference. The NFL is about the players, that players are what make the league special and make it sing. And I think he actually embodied that as a coach in a way that we don't see a lot of.
Totally. I mean, Pete Carroll is unique in an almost innumerable amount of ways. But one thing that becomes very pertinent now is that he wasn't just the head coach. I mean, Pete Carroll was the vice president of football operations and the de facto CEO of what is essentially a Fortune 500 company. Now, maybe he sticks around in some sort of advisory or C-suite role, but that's not the feeling I got watching that press conference. Talk to me about what replacing Pete Carroll really means and what type of person is the best fit trying to fill those shoes.
Yeah, it is going to be really interesting to see what his role is. And I think that might also have an impact on the job, who fills it, the desirability of it. And to your point, his involvement in roster construction was real. I think it's part of the reason probably why, similar to Bill Belichick,
yes,
he is no longer the head coach. Because, we can talk about, it's pretty simple. It doesn't take a lot to explain, because this is a team that has been successful in recent years, missed playoffs here and there, made it some years, but the defense has been bad now for several years.
Yeah.
But the defense isn't just bad because of coaching, execution, whatever. The roster construction has flaws, and Carroll has been given resources to fix it. They have, had early draft picks, latest draft, obviously, trades, the Jamal Adams trade, the Leonard Williams trade, and we on the outside will never know exactly how much of that can be attributed to Carroll versus Schneider, and whether there was disagreement, whether these moves were led by one or the other. But because of the failure of that unit, I think Carroll ultimately probably took a lot of blame for it, and fairly so. So you asked about the job. It's funny because I just showed you, I made this like little board.
Let's see it.
The video audience. It's for my YouTube, where I was ranking all the jobs by quarterback roster, and I wrote et cetera, like ownership, vibes.
Right.
And Seattle ended up ranking very high. I actually ended up with the Commanders higher, just because that's kind of like a blank slate job. You get to come in and completely build that team in your image, and the new ownership is desirable. Seattle, I think, I do think that they underperformed relative to their talent level on both offense and defense. I do think it's a good roster. I think a ding on it is I wouldn't want to play in that division with Shanahan and McVay, frankly.
That's fair.
I think that's a challenge, and those teams are obviously very good. But it is desirable. Like, I think there's a couple questions, one of which is, does the new coach want to stick with Geno Smith? I would. I don't think Seattle, I think it's pretty unlikely that Seattle would upgrade at the quarterback position. Maybe if they want to take a shot in the draft, I wouldn't object to that. But I do think Geno should be the quarterback next year. But I think, the question is like, okay, well, what is it going to take to fix this defense? Is it a talent thing? Is it a coaching thing? Do we need a schematic shift? Carroll tried a bunch of different schemes. That is something else that the coach has to figure out. I don't think that it really is, it has to be an offensive or a defensive coach, part because you have the experienced quarterback. So it's not like, we need to bring in a guy who can raise this young pup and call this perfect offense. But I think you'd like to see some innovation on both sides of the ball from where they were this year.
Yeah.
I will say this, Jackson, it is very hard to project success for head coaches in the NFL. I have been wrong. I've been proven wrong. I have been surprised pleasantly by guys. Dan Campbell. I wasn't like a big anti-Dan Campbell person, but when the Lions hired him, I was like, really? That guy?
Yep.
All right. It kind of struck me by surprise. And I think he's been phenomenal for them.
Yes.
So for Seattle, I think there's a lot of good options out there. I know Dan Quinn is the name who's been thrown around a lot. And I'll start by saying I don't think that would be a bad decision I know that there's a little bit of skepticism because it feels like more of the same. I get that, but I think it's worth noting, and we talked about this. Dan Campbell has really evolved his defense in Dallas. They've done it's very different from what it was in Seattle, and he's tried a bunch of different things, and he's been very creative. And I think could do the same in Seattle. I think he's a great teacher, beloved by players. Didn't have success ultimately, as a head coach, which, I mean, he did make it to the Super Bowl. So like that isn't totally unsuccessful.
Right.
I don't think that would be a miss, but I would be thrilled if they went with one of the hotshot coordinators, Ben Johnson, Mike McDonald too.
Okay. So yeah, I do want to ask you that because there are a dozen or more names that are being floated as Pete's successor. And again, it's all hypothetical at this point. At least I haven't heard anything about like inside track, someone having more traction than someone else. But there are also a number of other head coaching jobs available. Like you said, the Commanders job has its attraction. I think the Atlanta job has some real attraction. The Chargers would be a high profile opportunity for somebody. You've got a great quarterback. It's LA. Give me the top 3 or 4 names that you most want to have as Seattle's head coach. And then tell us who you think is the most likely.
Well, let me start here. This won't happen, but like I would take Bill Belichick.
Would you?
Somebody who I think could fix
that would be so
defense.
Different culture-wise. I mean, you talk about revamping the culture.
I know. But let me say, first of all, 2 things about Belichick. Players don't like love him the way they love Pete Carroll, but I have talked. Michael Bennett, who loves Pete, also told me he enjoyed he likes Bill Belichick. Like I just I don't think he's not like a hardo the way a lot of his successors proved to be in the NFL. Yeah. I think he would be a good choice because if there's, we're talking about people who can fix that defense, holy smokes, that guy. I mean, as bad as the Patriots offense has been, the defense has continued to be one of the best in the NFL. They actually finished this year top 10 in like every metric, despite the fact that they lost their best pass rusher and young corner. So like, that would be fine with me.
Okay, all right. I'd be a little bit bummed if it was Bill Belichick,
dude. I think so. In NFL history.
Well, totally.
They're not going to do it, so we can just throw it.
Okay.
It's not going to happen.
Okay. Yeah, we don't got to spend a lot of time. If it happens, we'll talk more about that. That's interesting that you'd be on board with that. So so we got Belichick as one of the guys you'd be stoked about. You mentioned the hotshot coordinators. Give me some specific names.
Both of Ben Johnson and Mike McDonald.
Those are my top 2.
Those are the top 2. They should be the top 2, of outside of Harbaugh and Belichick and Vrabel, who are kind of also, that they're sort of in a different group. But I think Ben Johnson, what he's done with that offense in Detroit, the way he has rebuilt Jared Goff to some extent, his ability to call an offense not just around the skills of his players, which is they have a pretty unique group of skill players, but his the way he sequences plays it's very McVay-like, the way he makes things look alike in a way that I think he could do some really cool stuff in Seattle. And then Mike McDonald, I think, is right now the best defensive mind in football. I mean, you saw that with his performance. I mean, with Seattle, it feels every year inevitable that Kyle Shanahan is just going to, rip through this defense. Well, he's a guy who shut down Kyle Shanahan, shut down Mike McDaniel. Like, doesn't really get more impressive than that in the current NFL. So those would be, I would choose those 2 probably over anyone, frankly. Harbaugh's too weird. That'd be too weird.
That would be so bizarre. And I actually don't hate it. And maybe me saying that is evoking a similar response in the listeners to what I had when you said Belichick. But Harbaugh is an interesting one. Who would you be most bummed about if you woke up tomorrow and found out that the Seahawks hired him as head coach of like the realistic options? Yeah,
I'm trying to think because there's all the guys we mentioned. I wouldn't be that bummed about. Even Vrabel, like I don't think it's the right fit, but he's a really good coach. He'd probably, I think.
I don't want another mud wrestler though.
I know. I think he would fix I think he could do some stuff. That defense has been pretty creative in Tennessee, so I think that's something that I would be excited about, and I like his mind. But no, so I wouldn't be bummed about that. Trying to think of the names that I've seen who are actually getting interviews. I haven't seen anyone associated with Seattle that made me like really, really nervous. Raheem Morris feels a little like Pete, although deserves a lot of credit for making that Rams defense play better than Seattle, even though it's literally guys who no one's ever heard of. So I do think he's a really, really good coach, and I wouldn't be like horrified or anything. I just think it maybe isn't quite the change that they'd be looking for. I don't know. What about you? Who have you seen any names that have? I haven't, because the names in this cycle are so good that you're not really seeing like bad names.
They're really good. Yeah, actually, I'm gonna defer to Mike here because he and I were kind of bandying this about a little bit. Mike, what are your thoughts on this?
If Brandon Staley ends up the Seahawks coach, I'm swan diving into a wood chipper.
A real name.
Yeah.
I haven't seen. I saw Brian Johnson, the Eagles offensive coordinator, got a job, and the replies were pretty funny.
Let's get Matt Patricia in there. Fuck it.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. I would be very bummed about Matt Patricia.
I gotta look at the list of who else is being considered.
Well, okay. So here's the thing: a couple of names that have popped up that I think, certainly from a schematic standpoint, are interesting. Brian Flores and Eric Bieniemy. The challenge with those, they've had tremendous success in their roles as coordinators, and I think they will be head coaches at some point. There's some vibes challenges there, I think. There's at least some whispers about, and maybe it's just because the framework that I view this through is with such a player forward coach that we've had for so long. And we've seen the success of a coach just buying into his players.
Yeah.
But Brian Flores' time in Miami and his relationship with Tua, sounds straight up toxic. You've heard some similar things with Bieniemy. I would love to have either of those guys' schemes in Seattle. I wonder about their ability to run an entire program. And I'm like you, if we're just talking about on Sundays, Benny Johnson, Mike McDonald, those two are top of the list because I have so much faith in them schematically. But the thing that made Pete Carroll so successful is what he did Monday through Saturday. And someone who's never, I don't know anything about those guys' culture, at least with Dan Quinn. To me, Dan Quinn is the B+ hire. He's the one where I feel like he's not going to fail. Seattle is going to win. Their defense is going to be better. And to his credit, when he was a head coach, he got out of the way of the offense. He, was fortunate to hire Kyle Shanahan, but the Falcons kicked serious ass when Dan Quinn was there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think with coaches like him, and I think Morris is probably similar now that I think about it. The offensive coordinator hire, and, every job in Seattle is open right now, will be pretty significant. So it's whether it's Quinn, if it was Quinn or Morris, could they find their Bobby Slowick,
my gosh, right,
who they can pluck from? By the way, Slowick's the name. I'd be a little bit nervous about him and Dave Canales. And those are two names I think they'll probably hear associated with Seattle. Yeah,
those were the two I was going to ask you about next. Literally those two, because the first odds came out on the Seahawks job. And I don't think, a lot of times, Vegas is based on some sort of insider knowledge. I think other times they throw out names and see where the money lands, and then they move the lines. But when those first names came out, Dan Quinn was even money. He was 1-to-1 to be the next head coach, and then Vrabel was 2, and then Bobby Slowick was 3.
I would like to see more than 1 year out of both of those play callers.
Yeah,
and I the Houston offense. I mean, obviously, what he's done with Stroud is impressive, incredibly impressive. But I also don't. I think Stroud is also responsible for a lot of what we're seeing there. I just don't. I think it's just a little bit soon for both of those play callers.
Yep, fair.
It sounded yesterday in Pete's press conference that he made it very clear that he didn't want to stop coaching. So, hypothetical here. You have your pick of the available jobs, and you're slotting Pete Carroll in as the CEO of that organization as the head coach. Mina, what team are you pairing Pete with?
The Chargers make probably the most sense because LA, Pete, there's a quarterback there, defense needs to be fixed. Though, like I said, I don't even know if our defense finished that much better than the Chargers defense when all
well,
is said and done.
And culturally, the ties to the community. I mean, he started a better LA where he would literally hop in a van and go downtown and like meet with inner city kids and gang members and talk to them about life. You know, a $10 million head coach out there doing it. So he's got the connections.
I'll be curious to see whether Pete stays coaching. I think right now it's kind of up in the air. Honestly, it seems like he was like sort of blindsided by all of this. I mean, you know, both him and Bill Belichick being 72, you know, that has to factor into their decision making as well. That's the one that comes to mind. It's hard for me to imagine him with a rebuilding organization. And a lot of these teams, I'm looking at the jobs, they are rebuilds. I mean, the Falcons are not. The Raiders are in a weird spot. The Patriots are not, but they're kind of in a weird spot. And I don't think succeeding Belichick is something that there's a lot of questions about that. But like the Panthers, still very, you know, they're still in the rebuild. The Titans are very much rebuilding. I mean, I think maybe the Falcons would be my second choice, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny to imagine a relationship between Pete Carroll and Dean Spanos with the Chargers, but who knows? And here's the thing, like shifting back to Seattle, whoever does get the gig has an interesting offseason ahead of them. The Seahawks will pick 16th. Yeah. They're in neither a great or a terrible position cap wise. And they're about to go in a different direction philosophically, for better or worse. But one thing that came out of Pete's final presser was the revelation that it's essentially John Schneider's show now. If you were in John's position, what are you prioritizing this offseason for the Seahawks?
I think ideally he would work hand in glove with the new head coach to make sure they are calling a defense, building a defense with the right personnel. And I think when you look back at the last 6 years and some of the issues they've had with different schemes and there have been personnel. It's an odd situation because there's talent on the defense, but they've not lived up to the talent. And I think a lot of times that's been because of a mismatch of scheme and personnel or holes, you know, that with the wrong players. I'll throw out edge is an issue, although you get Nosu back and Mafe flashed at times. Corner ended up being a massive issue because of Woolen's regression and the tackling problems. But when I think about this division and I think about the Rams and the Niners, they really, really need off-ball linebacker. I don't know what happens with Jordan Brooks. Unfortunately, the injury stuff's real with him, so he might be gone for that reason. But you just look at Baltimore and the way they prioritized that position, trading for Roquan Smith and the impact that it had on that defense. And there's a lot of other good players on that defense, of course. No. But I think if they could find a really good off-ball linebacker, that would go a long way towards making this defense more competitive, specifically in the division. Yeah,
when you look at the players that have the most outsized impact on their team success in terms of if you move this player from one team to another, it moves the needle. It's obviously quarterback, but then it's wide receiver and it's edge rusher / off-ball linebacker. And Seattle hasn't had that at that position. They've had good quarterback play. They've had great wide receiver play. That thing has been missing. And let's just zero in on quarterback here for a minute. Quarterbacking is almost always going to be the point of discussion between seasons for almost every other team. We now have a 2-year sample with Geno Smith at the helm, and outside of Kirk Cousins, who, while I think he's a legitimately an excellent quarterback, he's older, he's more expensive, he's coming off a major injury, and there isn't a lot available in free agency at that position this year. By contrast, the draft class is being heralded as unusually deep at quarterback and is headlined by a number of big names. So given what we've seen from Geno and considering his contract situation, how many QBs in this draft have to be off the board before you say, yeah, we're sticking with Geno? Or let me put it another way. Which QBs would need to be available at 16 or within a reasonable trade-up spot to take one this year?
I still have to watch all of the QBs in depth, so that's a big caveat for me. I think probably the top 3 are the ones where you would want you would seriously consider moving on. So,
and that's that's Caleb Williams, Drake May, Jaden Daniels.
Drake May, yes, and Jaden Daniels. And 2 of those 3, I don't think they have any shot at. Jaden Daniels, increasingly, it seems like will go top 5. So
I think he's going to be this year's Anthony Richardson. He's going to scream to the top of the board.
My belief is that the Seahawks should just stick with Geno. I think he's firmly in that 10 to 15 range, maybe even like 9 to 13, to be honest.
Totally agree. The stats certainly back that up.
And the eye test, man. Like,
yes.
The Steelers game to me is just such a perfect microcosm of this season. He played out of his mind. He was under constant pressure. He was stepping up, making crazy throws. Pass protection was lacking.
He had godlike moments in that game. The touchdown to JSN was an outrageously ballsy throw.
Yeah, the defense collapsed. That was a meltdown.
Yeah, it was.
The defense, absolute. I mean, just the broken tackles and it's just
the defense's performance in that game might have been the death knell for Pete Carroll.
I think so, because owners really don't like being embarrassed, and I thought that was an embarrassing game for Seattle. They had the chance. They could have iced it. I mean, not iced it. They'd have to win against Arizona too, but like they had control over their destiny.
Yes.
So, anyways, to go back to Geno, I would stick with him. I think he's at $31 million next year, which
that's right.
Sounds like a lot, but is actually not a lot in quarterback money these days.
No, it's not.
Maybe you can I would even potentially consider restructuring him, although the contract obviously is super favorable now because they can get out of it at any time. Worth taking a flyer on a quarterback later. I don't really know. I haven't really spent time with the later round names.
Well, then let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Michael Penix is there at 16.
This won't be popular with Seattle. I'm a Huskies fan. I am a little skeptical.
Okay.
Yeah, and I loved him as a college quarterback, and maybe I'll change my mind, but I think that there are concerns I have about his ability to be better than Geno, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's funny, in our text thread, we were talking about this has got to be a month or 2 ago. We were talking about comps for Penix because Danny was writing him up, and I said he reminds me of Geno Smith coming out of college if he wasn't a knucklehead. And he plays the game the same way. And it's like, well, if you already have that guy, maybe you don't take the gamble.
Yeah, and right. And honestly, he would have to develop certain aspects of his game to play the way Geno has the last couple of years, especially the ability to throw to the middle of the field and some of the and Geno's accuracy. He's a very accurate quarterback. Penix, has had a little bit of ups and downs at times. The dude has an absolute cannon attached to his shoulder and is a playmaker too. But the draft process will be really interesting for him. It'll be interesting to see how much he gets dinged for playing with like an NFL receiver trio.
Yeah.
He's a very fun player. I would love for him to be successful in the NFL. But as far as Seattle, the timeline, Geno, and then more importantly, the other needs on this roster, that's not a direction that I would go in.
Yeah. I'm more bullish on Penix as a pro than you are, but I understand the concerns. I mean, shit, after the Texas game, he was going top 5. And then after the Michigan game, it's like it kind of came back to earth a little bit.
Michigan game. They played Michigan?
Yeah. Right. That was tough to watch. It's interesting to me because we're not going to spend a ton of time on Penix. Maybe if there's some smoke there over the next few months, we'll talk about it more. But I think that the ability to throw an accurate ball to the third level in college is the skill that is most indicative of NFL success. And I don't think anybody in college football was better at throwing to the third level than Michael Penix. He has limitations for sure elsewhere. But that's the piece that gives me hope. Listen, Mina, before we get out of here, and super grateful for your time because I know how crazy your schedule is right now, but how are you feeling just all told, stepping back and just looking at it as a whole? Yeah. How are you feeling about the Seahawks as someone who not only covers the NFL for a living, but who has rooted for this team your whole life?
I'm really just intrigued right now. We were kind of going through all the different phases in response to the Carroll news. And especially watching that press conference, it was just like heartbreaking. And you go back to memories, as you so eloquently did. It's tough.
I was like legitimately mad for 20 straight minutes watching that press conference that he wasn't going to be the coach anymore.
It's sad. However, Jackson, if he was the coach and you and I were having this conversation, would either of us have confidence that the team would take another step next year or fix some of the issues we're talking about? And look, this could backfire.
Not with conviction.
Yeah, it could backfire. They could hire the wrong guy. It could be worse. The defense could be worse than what we've seen. But it did feel like some sort of change was necessary, and it was hard for me to imagine Pete rehauling his coaching staff in a way that would fix some of the issues we've talked about.
If we're talking head, not heart, it was time. It was time.
Yeah.
It's the heart that makes it hurt.
I know.
I'm like tearing up talking with you about it right now. Oh, man. Listen, Mina, I said it at the top, but I meant it. We couldn't ask for a better person to talk about one of the biggest moments in this team's history than you. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me. This was fun. Very curious to see what we do. I'll be tuning in.
Well, we'll have you back on and we'll see where we stand when that happens. And last thing, if there's anyone listening who for some reason doesn't already know where they can get more of you, where can they get more of you?
Yeah, the Mina Kimes Show featuring Lenny is my podcast. We talked about Pete Carroll. We'll talk about whatever coach they end up hiring. And then you can also watch it on YouTube. And that sort of chart I showed you, I'm making videos for YouTube now every week. One of the videos is ranking the coaching jobs. Seattle comes out pretty high in it. So you can check it out at youtube.com/@MinaKimes.
All right, y'all. That's going to do it for a very emotional and very important edition of Cigar Thoughts. As always, you can find Mike and I on social media. I am on Twitter at @JacksonBevins. That's JACSON. Remember that no K is okay when spelling my name. Mike is on Twitter at @MikeBarwin, and the show itself is @Cigar Thoughts. You can catch full video episodes on our YouTube channel @Cigar Thoughts and find the rest of our socials at cigarthoughtsnfl.com. Of course, you can listen to this show and read every article, including the one I wrote last night, a tribute to Pete Carroll, at fieldgoals.com. And if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and you like the show, drop us a 5-star rating and leave a quick review. Finally, be sure to check out cigarthoughtsnfl.com to get your exclusive Cigar Thoughts cigars, or hit me up on Twitter and I'll shoot you the deets. When you buy those cigars, reach out like many of you have and tell us what you think. Thank you to all of y'all listening for your continued support of the show. We know you've only got so much time for podcasts in your life, and it's an honor to be a part of that for y'all. Please know that by sharing the show on social media and with your friends, you give us the juice to keep making this happen. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, onwards and upwards, my friends.